Hi everybody. So let's see the practical project we are going to develop in the next couple of lessons. So the coding is in the background and this is the coding you will be learning. And when you run this app, you will see a dynamic user interface generated. What I mean by a dynamic user interface is, let's say if the user select a question like what is your gender, then it dynamically generates the user interface. And if the user select a choice and click next, it will dynamically figure out what the choice and store it. Let's say it stores it. And let's say if you select another question like what are the banks you are dealing with, then it shows a different set of user interfaces generated dynamically where the user can select, let's say, the options and click next, and then those options are again written or saved for future reference. And let's say if the user select what is your name, then it dynamically generates the UI. And let's say the user can type something from the keyboard and click next, and then that value is stored once again. So this practical will show you how to develop a dynamic user interface and how to access the dynamic user interface elements dynamically. When I say access dynamically, because when you click the next button, you don't know whether it can be a checkbox list or it can be radio buttons or it can be something else. So that is what I mean. When you click the next button, you will learn how to dynamically figure it out, whether it's a checkbox or radio buttons and likewise. So this is a very simple exercise, but it's very powerful and it will give you advanced knowledge about dynamic user interface developments. So we are very excited to develop this app, and now let's go and develop this app. Hi everyone. So welcome to Dynamic UI Simple Example Part 3. Make sure to look Part 1 and Part 2 before this. We'll be using these tools for this lecture, and you need to have these prerequisites before you do this lecture. Make sure to cover this before you do this. And in this lesson you will be learning about these points. Once again, look at Part 1 and Part 2 for you to understand what are these points, because we discussed in part 1 and part 2, and then look at we'll be doing this as a practical lesson. So now let's go and start doing the practical demonstration for this part. So in this is what we developed in at the end of part 2, where we can select a component and then it dynamically develops the populates with the component. So this is dynamic UI creation. So now what I want to do next is, instead of telling text box, checkbox or radio button, I want to say, let's say we want to ask what is your name. So the user can type the name. Then maybe what are the new banks you are dealing with. Then maybe instead of radio button, to ask what is your gender. Okay, so now let's do that part. So for you to do that, what you have to do is you have to do a couple of changes. When you are adding the items, I will show you. If I will just copy this and show you, so you will understand, so that you all will understand. So whenever you are creating a new list item, you can see when I open, you can see that it's overloaded 4 times, 1 of 4. And in the first method, it's empty constructor. Then you can see you can either create it with a text. That is what we have done in these lines. We created a list item with a text, but if you look at the next overloaded method, you can give a text and a value. Now this is what I want in this case, a text and a value. So the first one is a text and the second one is a value. So first parameter. So now knowing that the first parameter is the text. So as the text I want to display, let's say, what is your name, right? So what is your name, something like that. And then let's do the same thing for the checkbox and the radio button as well. So then what is your age? Not age actually. What are the newspapers you are reading? What are the something like that. And then what is your gender? Let's run this. Then you will see it's a text and a value. So now you will see when you run, what is your name? What are the newspapers you read? Okay. and what is your gender. Now why it is not working is when you do this change, now this is not the text, because at the moment in the selected index change of the drop down you are requesting for the text, and you are checking whether that text is a text box or whether that text is a checkbox. But now, as you saw, this is not the text, this is the value. This is the text, this is the value, as I said a little while ago. So in that case, instead of asking for text, I will just keep this line and comment it, so you can have a look. You can always see that line also, but we will not use the text. Instead of the text, we will use the value of the selected item. Value is a property. So I'm getting the value of the selected item, which is the second parameter, right? The second parameter is the value. Now it will work. So then if that value is a text box or checkbox, likewise, so the value is checkbox, the value is radio button. So if I run this now, you will see that this will work. So what are the newspapers? You can see the user can select, once again it's not it's the bank, so I have to change that. And what is the gender, male or female, and let's say what is your name, you can say John Davis. So now let me quickly change that into banks. So I change the question as what are the banks you deal with. Now this is a very good, simple, very important but simple example for you to understand dynamic UI, because when I say what banks are you dealing with, see, you dynamically create the UI with a list of banks. This is dynamic UI creation. What is gender? For that, you dynamically generate the user interface with radio buttons. What is your name? For that, you dynamically generate the user interface with a text box. So this is dynamic user interface development. Now the next thing I want to do is, when I run this for the first time, whatever selected whatever the selected question, I want to dynamically populate this with the relevant user interface, which is not happening because it will work only when I click. It doesn't load when you run it for the first time. So why is it like that? That is because inside your page load, you are not checking, or you are not doing anything. So now let's try to do this in the page load. So in the page load, I'm going to do a few things. So what you have to do is, inside the page load, you will have to write the same coding what you have written inside the drop down selected index change. So the same code should go into the page load. So if I copy that and paste it here, the same code, I copied that and put it to the page load as well, the same code, but now that same code is duplicated once in the selected index change and now inside page load. So this is called duplication, but this will work. So when I run it, when the page is loading, now you can see that text box appears, because in the page load we are checking the same logic. We are checking what is the selected value, and then we will be adding. But now, because there's code duplication, what we can do is we can write a method and avoid this code duplication. So you can write your own private method. Let's say private void. Let's say you can give a name. Let's say you can say generate dynamic UI. This is your own user defined method, right? Generate dynamic UI. And inside into this, what you can do is you can cut this code from that set selected index. You can just cut the code okay, from the sets, and you can just put it here. And now you can simply, inside selected index change, you can simply call this method. So you can just call the method from over here, right? And then let's do the same thing. Let's now from the page load, we can delete this and just call that method. So now this avoids code duplication. So you call the generate dynamic UI method. So now let's run and see if this works. See, now you can see it's working, and every time I click, so there are certain errors which we have to correct, right? So we will look into those errors one by one. Now when you look at this carefully, if you put this method into the page load as well, and if the same method is inside uh, sets selected index change, it will execute this method twice. That is because, now let's say when you run this code, now the code is loaded, the page is loaded for the first time, right? So there is no drop down index click. But if I click this, let's say what is your gender, now the click event of the drop down also will trigger, plus the page load also will trigger. So when I click this, it's going to duplicate that twice, because when I click on, let's say if I click on this, the click event of the drop down also will work, plus the page load also will work. Because of that, it's duplicating, because then inside the click event also you are calling generate dynamic UI, and from the page load also you are calling generate dynamic UI. So if you look at this, if you think about this carefully, every time you click on the drop down, as we explained in the part 1 and part 2, it sends data, it does a post, it posts data to the server, to the page, it loads the page. So every time you click on the drop down, it is loading the page. We discussed this in part 1 and part 2. So if you think about that carefully, this means if you are calling this method from inside the page load, I mean this method generate dynamic UI, then actually you don't have to call it from inside the click event, because the reason is every time, so I will comment this, because every time you click, it's also loading the page. So we explained this in the previous parts. So have a look at that, then you will understand this. So let's look at this now with that change. So from the drop down selected index change, I'm commenting, meaning I am removing it. I'm just keeping it over here. So if I run this now, so if I run this, you can see very carefully. So you can see now it loads the text box, what is your name, and if I click what is your gender, so now it's not duplicating, because now I commented it from the drop down click, and because it's loading the page and I left it all in the page load. So now you can see that this is in action, right? Okay, so this is dynamic user interface developments, dynamic user interface creation. So these errors we will have to solve, right? One by one, we'll be solving them. So if I run this once again, so the errors we'll have to solve one by one. But if I click on this, let me stop this. So you have to do a couple of things. One thing is you have to make sure uh, you clear the placeholder controls, right? So just put this line over here, because you're adding, you keep on adding items, right? So it's better to clear the controls before you add anything. And then to avoid that error you are getting, what you have to do is, when you call this method generate dynamic UI, when you call it let's say from the page load, you have to do it inside this if condition, because you can't uh, because when you call generate dynamic UI, because that method is getting the from the drop down, it's getting the selected item value, and if you put it outside this over here, right, if you put it outside, now in overall what instead of putting it outside, if you put it inside over here, so what happens is, for the first time when the page is getting loaded, it creates it adds all the items to drop down, and it generates the dynamic UI, and so that it executes this method. But now, because you are doing it inside this if condition, this will execute only when the page is getting loaded for the first time, because you are checking whether it is not a pause back. So which means now when you click on the drop down, let's say when you run this and click on the drop down, now if I comment this from here and if I'm not calling it from the drop down, what will happen is, so if you run this, so when it loads, okay, it's fine. But if I click on a checkbox, or if I click on the, let's say what is gender, now you are not getting the dynamic UI generated, because every time you select an item from the drop down, the page loads, but it's but because if you have if condition telling if it is not, if not is pause back, which means every time you click the drop down, when the page loads, when you click a drop down, it's a pause back, but you are checking if it's not a pause back, which means when you click on the drop down, it is a pause back, so this will not work because of this if condition. Because of that, when you click on the items in the drop down, now it will not generate the UI. So then what you have to do is simply uncomment this from here, so that every time you click an item from the list box, it will generate the dynamic UI. Right, so every time you click item on the drop down, it generates the dynamic UI. Plus also when it's loading the page for the first time, it also generates a dynamic UI. So this will solve the problem. So now if you run this, you will see that the problem is solved. It loads it for the first time, and you can type, let's say, your name. You can type it from the keyboard, and then let's say what banks you deal with. Okay, ANZ, and whatever the banks, and let's say the gender, right? And then let's say now you go and select the bank. So now this dynamic UI creation works. So this is how you experiment dynamic user interface development, right? Okay, so now you covered a lot of points you have so far with the completion of part 3. You have covered a lot of from this, the dynamic UI, how to create it, but still this bullet point, finding and accessing components dynamically, we will be doing it in the next part. Placeholders, find, control, we will be doing it in the next part. And view state also we'll be doing in the next part. So we'll be doing those in the next part when, let's say, when you want to, let's say you click an item, let's say mail, and then when you click next, let's assume this as a survey software, like SurveyMonkey, like a survey software. So when you click next, let's say you want to save this whatever the selected items to the database, right? I'm just giving example, right? Say if you have selected this and this, and when you click, let's say when you click next, whatever the selected items you want to save, let's say you want to save to the database. So now if you want to save it to the database, you need to dynamically see what user has selected or what user has clicked. Let's say if it is this checkboxes, you need to dynamically find, okay, what has been selected by the user. Then only you can save it to the database. So when you click on the next button, we need to dynamically see what has been selected by the user. So for you to do that, you have to find and access the UI components dynamically from the placeholder. You have to find the controls, and then you will be getting the help of, let's say, a view state object to finish that task. So that is what we'll be doing in the next part. So we are very excited to see you in the next part to complete this, and see you all in the next part of this lesson.